Assembly member, thanks so much for your time today and agreeing to meet with us. Today, we're here to tell you more about a really important piece of climate legislation that we all support, and we hope that we can convince you to support it as well. And this is SB 308, or the Carbon Dioxide Removal Market Development Act, which was introduced last year by Senator Josh Becker and has already passed in the state Senate. Over the last many months, the support coalition in favor of SB 308 has continued to grow and expand, and this includes a really diverse mix of environmental and climate advocacy organizations, both national and local, as well as a strong cross section of carbon removal companies based here in California. Now, what SB 308 concerns carbon dioxide removal, or CDR, or sometimes just called carbon removal. And what this is what it sounds like. These are activities that take carbon that's already in the air out of the air and put it in places where it will stay for a long, long period of time. And it's really important to make a critical distinction because there's some confusion around this, is that carbon removal is not carbon capture. Those things are often confused. Carbon capture is where you prevent emissions from going up into the air by stopping them at a point source, and then you sequester or store them somewhere. Carbon removal is not preventing emissions from going into the air. It's taking emissions out of the air and putting them someplace, again, where they'll stay for a long period of time. Different things. And why are we hearing more and more about carbon removal as part of the overall climate discourse? That's because it's necessary. And this is according to the UN IPCC and other scientific bodies globally. We need to now take carbon out of the air in addition to stopping emitting, because we've already emitted too much, and because many forms of emissions are very difficult economically and equitably to immediately decarbonize within a time frame that's relevant for climate action. So carbon removal is widely established now as a necessary element of addressing and confronting climate change. And here locally in California, with our net zero law established by AB 1279, carbon removal has an important role to play. This law requires net zero by 2045, but it says that at least 85% of the emissions will be reduced or eliminated. So that creates a gap of about 15%, which is really made up of those hard to abate forms of emissions from industry, agriculture, and other sources that can't be easily reduced within this time frame. Now, California is also unique in an important way among other states, and that is that it has already acknowledged through the California Air Resources Board's 2022 scoping plan that that 15% is going to have to be achieved through carbon dioxide removal. The scoping plan is actually very explicit about this, as this quote suggests. Carbon removal and sequestration is essential to achieving net zero, according to the state's own math. And the scoping plan actually very specifically calculated how much carbon removal will be required annually by 2030 and then by 2045. And it would go up. And it calculated that 7 million metric tons of carbon removal will be required by 2030 and then 75 million by the time we get to 2045 in order for carbon removal to fill that net zero gap. And another really important element of this is that CARB also pointed out that while we might need this later into this decades and century, we have to start now, because you can't just flip on a switch later on and expect CDR to be available. You have to start building that capability right now, and CARB is very explicit about this as well. So then how can California actually advance carbon removal to meet its net zero goals? From a solutions perspective, it's important to know that carbon removal actually is incredibly diverse. It's a spectrum. Some carbon removal solutions take place on land, others can take place at sea, in the ocean. Some forms of carbon removal are large, industrial, and centralized. Others take the form of very small and distributed forms of applications. Many forms of carbon removal actually are anchored in farming and nature-based and working lands types of applications, from biochar to algae sinking and biomass burial. There are many of those. While many others are applied in other contexts and often involve very advanced or high-tech types of solutions. And these varies from direct air capture to ocean alkalinity enhancement and various forms of turning CO2 into minerals. So there's many, many different ways to do carbon removal. And fortunately for California, we really have it all when it comes to how we, as a large, uh, resource-rich state, can actually do carbon removal. And we have, in fact, the conditions in terms of natural resources and human resources to really do almost all forms of carbon removal within our state. And one other massive advantage that makes California quite unique is that we already are home to the world's largest concentration of CDR companies, investors, and buyers. We already have an industrial lead with this. We're also the home to some of the leading CDR research centers. The various national labs and universities are significant globally. And again, from north to south and east to west, we have an abundance of different forms of natural resources that are required to make different forms of carbon removal possible. So we have an amazing mix of capabilities here in California to do carbon removal. And this is really significant for two reasons. One, from a climate perspective and helping California reach its net zero goals, but also from an economic perspective. Carbon removal is projected to become $1 trillion industry in the coming years and decades. And California has everything that it needs to be a global leader in this future sector that will produce revenues and jobs here within California. And this is where SB 308 comes in. It's anchored in AB 1279, our net zero law, which already recognizes that 15% gap. And what SB 308 does is that it draws on the data and recommendations of the 2022 scoping plan in regard to carbon removal, and it would legislate or require the state to actually begin to ramp up carbon removals to fill that 15% net zero gap. The time frame for the bill will be between 2028 and 2045, and it would start by supporting relatively small amounts of carbon removal just to get things moving forward. Then over the subsequent years up till 2045, it would ramp up that amount of carbon removal that would be required, ultimately having it fill out 100% of that 15% gap. What the bill does is it authorizes or directs CARB to actually develop a CDR support mechanism that's appropriate within the state based on our existing policy landscape and other resources we can bring to it. Such an approach would be designed as well, very importantly, to foster the growth of many different forms of carbon dioxide removal that can be done throughout the state. So to have a diverse portfolio of carbon removal solutions that help fill that gap. And in the process, that would help support many of the CDR companies or the existing CDR ecosystem that we have here in California that would help establish our local in-state sector. And to get all of this started, between the passage of the law in 2028, the burden is to make sure that we create a selection criteria that is designed to eliminate any risks to any Californians or communities and to take into account what are the benefits that can happen, not only from a carbon removal perspective, but from a job creation perspective, economic development perspective, public safety perspective, and ecosystem and biodiversity perspective. And again, that would be on CARB with consultation, obviously, from multiple stakeholders pre-implementation to develop that criteria, both around how do we verify that carbon removal has happened, what forms are eligible, et cetera, et cetera. CARB would be authorized to do that. So that's a quick summary of SB 308. We think it's a extremely significant piece of legislation, not only here for California, but the world. The world is watching. This is widely acknowledged as the most serious, ambitious, and science-aligned carbon removal support policy proposed anywhere in the world. And we think it's only appropriate that California leads like it always has done in both directly confronting a climate need and creating value and opportunity in the process. So we do hope that you will support this bill and co-sponsor it. And please let us know if you have any questions.